Ours, the Lawson Mansion, stood tall and proud at the edge of the city, a house built with glass, marble, and memories. Every corner gleamed with wealth, but inside those walls lived a silence that no one could afford to break. In the room overlooking the garden sat a boy who had forgotten how to smile. 10-year-old Richard Lawson Jr. had once been the laughter of this house, the kind of child whose joy could light up every room. But now that light was gone. He sat in his wheelchair by the window every day, staring out at the sky with eyes that no longer dreamed. It had been 1 year since the accident, the crash that took his mother's life and left him paralyzed from the waist down. 1 year since his world went from bright and loud to quiet and gray. His father, Edward Lawson, one of the richest men in the country, had built skyscrapers that touched the clouds. People called him the man who built the sky. But now he lived inside an empty one. For all his money, all his power, he couldn't rebuild what he had lost: the laughter of his wife and the smile of his son. Every morning Edward left for meetings he no longer cared about. Every night he returned to sit by his son's side, whispering words into the silence. "Junior, Daddy's here. Can you hear me?" But Richard never replied. His eyes stayed fixed on the same spot, a tree outside the window where he used to chase butterflies with his mother. Edward had spent fortunes trying to heal his son. He brought in the best doctors from Germany, therapists from India, and psychologists from the United States. He built a special therapy room in the mansion and even imported a robotic exosuit that could help paralyzed patients walk again. But nothing worked. No machine could make his son want to live again. One evening, as Edward stood behind the window watching Richard, he whispered to himself, "I can build towers, but I can't build hope." Outside the walls of the Lawson Empire, life told a different story. Across the busy street near the hospital, a 12-year-old boy named Kenny ran between cars with a carton of bottled water pressed against his thin chest. His feet were bare, his shirt torn, his shorts hanging loosely around his bony waist. But his eyes carried something rare: joy. Kenny was one of those children the city forgot. He had no home, no family anyone knew of, and no promise of a better tomorrow. Yet somehow, he refused to surrender to misery. When drivers honked at him, he danced out of the way, laughing. When someone tossed him a coin, he bowed like a performer on stage. He sold water, but what he really gave out was happiness. Every afternoon after selling around the hospital, Kenny would rest under the large mango tree beside the parking lot. He would watch cars drive in and out, some carrying the sick, others the wealthy. It was there he noticed a black limousine that came often. Inside it sat a boy about his age, pale still, staring through the tinted glass with an emptiness that felt deeper than hunger. Kenny didn't know his name, but he felt something stir in his chest whenever he saw him. The boy looked lost, broken, lonely. One day, as the car stopped at the red light, their eyes met for the first time. It lasted barely a second, but Kenny didn't forget it. He had seen pain before. He lived with it every day, but never like that. That boy wasn't poor, yet he looked poorer than anyone Kenny had ever met. Later that evening, while resting under the same tree, Kenny whispered, "If I ever see him again, I'll make him smile." Days passed. The city moved fast. But inside the mansion, time stood still. Richard still sat by the window. Edward still begged for miracles. One afternoon, the driver parked the car by the hospital gate while Edward spoke with a doctor inside. Richard sat quietly, staring at nothing. That was when he saw him again. The barefoot boy from the street. Kenny was juggling 2 bottles of water, pretending they were trophies. A few drivers laughed. One tossed him a coin. He caught it mid-air and gave a clumsy bow. Dust swirled around his feet, sunlight bouncing off his grin. For a reason Richard couldn't explain, his lips twitched. Just a little, the tiniest ghost of a smile. From inside the car, the nurse noticed. "He moved," she whispered, her eyes wide. But when Edward returned, the moment had already passed. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He kept remembering the boy's face. Wild hair, bright eyes, and that unstoppable laughter. Somewhere deep inside, something flickered. something he thought was gone forever. The next day, Kenny came again, selling his water, running his usual routes. But this time, he looked up toward the hospital building. On the third floor, behind a large glass window, he saw a boy sitting by himself in a wheelchair. It was him. Kenny raised his hand and waved. No reaction. He tried again. Still nothing. So, he grabbed a small stick and drew a smiling face in the dust on the wall. He pointed at it, then at the boy, grinning like a fool. The boy didn't move. For the next few days, Kenny kept trying. Sometimes he waved. Sometimes he danced. Sometimes he just made silly faces, hoping the boy would notice. He didn't know why he kept doing it. He just felt like he had to. Maybe the boy needed it. Maybe he did. Then on the seventh day, as the evening sun painted the hospital in shades of gold, something happened. Kenny looked up again and saw him. The same boy, same window. He smiled and traced a silly face on the dusty glass. 2 eyes, a crooked nose, and a huge, funny grin. For a moment, there was only silence. Then from the other side of the window, a finger moved. Slowly, weakly, carefully. It drew a line, completing the smile. Kenny froze, staring up in disbelief. The boy had drawn back. The paralyzed boy had answered. He didn't know the boy's name. He didn't know his story. But he knew one thing. He'd made him smile. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Kenny stood there, grinning through the dust, waving at the window. He didn't see the nurse who was watching from the hallway, tears filling her eyes. He didn't see the small movement of Richard's hand as he lifted it weakly off the armrest. All Kenny saw was hope, and for that, he felt richer than any man in the world. Inside the mansion later that night, Edward sat by his son again. The machines hummed, the lights glowed softly, and for the first time in a year, something in the air felt different. Richard's eyes weren't fixed on the window anymore. They were alive, waiting. And far away, under the same sky, a barefoot boy lay beneath a mango tree, clutching an empty water bottle like a trophy. He smiled to himself and whispered, "I'll make him smile again tomorrow." That night, the mansion slept, but Richard didn't. He lay awake in his bed, the quiet hum of machines filling the room. For the first time in a long while, his eyes weren't staring into emptiness. They were fixed on something new, something small, something alive. He kept seeing that boy's face, the boy with messy hair, torn clothes, and a smile that seemed to belong to the sun itself. The boy who had stood under his window, waving like a friend who refused to give up. For the first time in months, Richard felt something stir inside him. Curiosity. The next morning came softly, sunlight breaking through the cream curtains of his room. The nurse came in quietly, checking the machines and whispering, "Good morning, Junior." He didn't reply, but she noticed it. His eyes shifted, searching the window. Outside, the day had already begun its rhythm. Drivers honked impatiently, traders shouted prices, and people hurried through their lives. Somewhere in the middle of all that noise was Kenny, balancing a crate of bottled water against his shoulder. He'd barely slept, but he didn't care. He had a new reason to wake up early now. When he reached the hospital junction, he did what he always did. Danced between cars, flashed his grin, sold his bottles. But every few minutes his eyes drifted upward, toward the third-floor window with the drawn smile. The glass was still dusty, the faint trace of his silly doodle still there. He smiled, waved, and waited. Nothing. The boy didn't move. "Maybe he's sleeping," Kenny muttered, setting his crate down. But he didn't stop coming. Every day after selling all his water, he'd walk to the same spot, look up, and wave. Sometimes he drew funny faces on the wall. Sometimes he made animal noises. Sometimes he just stood there and smiled until his cheeks hurt. And every day the boy in the window sat still, silent, motionless, unreachable. Yet Kenny refused to give up. He didn't know why. Maybe because he saw too much of himself in that boy, trapped behind something invisible. On the seventh day, the evening sky blazed orange. The street was quieter than usual, the traffic slow and gentle. Kenny's crate was empty, but he stayed. He looked up at the window, dusted off a stick, and began to draw again. 2 round eyes, a crooked nose, a big, silly grin. Then he waved, a small wave, hopeful, like a child asking life for a miracle. Inside the hospital room, Richard sat in his chair, his gaze fixed on the boy below. He'd watched him every day now, pretending not to. But something about that boy's stubborn joy made him want to respond. He stared at the dust-covered glass in front of him, at the smiling face drawn into it. Slowly, painfully, his right finger twitched. It was barely a movement, just a tremor, but it was something. Then with effort that made sweat bead on his forehead, he raised his hand and dragged his finger across the glass. Just one small line, clumsy, uneven, but real. He had completed the smile. Outside, Kenny froze. His eyes widened. He blinked, then laughed out loud. "He did it!" he shouted, pointing upward. "He moved!" People walking past barely looked. But for Kenny, that moment was magic. It was proof that someone behind that window was listening. Someone who'd chosen to answer. Inside, the nurse who came in to check Richard's monitors gasped when she saw it. His hand was pressed against the window, trembling. "Junior," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You moved. You actually moved." Tears filled her eyes as she ran out to call the doctor. But Richard wasn't thinking about medicine. He was looking down, smiling faintly for the first time in a year. And below, Kenny grinned so hard it hurt. From that day on, things began to change. Quietly, slowly, like dawn creeping into a dark room. Kenny kept coming back. Every afternoon around the same time, he would stand beneath that window and talk. Sometimes he told stories about his day, how he raced buses, how he dodged police chasing street hawkers, how one customer gave him extra coins because he made her laugh. Sometimes he sang old street songs, silly jingles, half-remembered lullabies from when his mother was still alive. Richard couldn't talk back, but he listened. And sometimes when Kenny's stories made him laugh, his fingers would tap lightly on the armrest, a small rhythm that only the nurse noticed. Every evening, when Edward returned from work, he found his son different. Eyes brighter, posture a little straighter, hands no longer limp in his lap. But he didn't understand why. "Has the new therapy worked?" he asked the nurse one night. The woman hesitated. "Maybe, sir," she said softly, "but I think it's something else." A week later, as the sky darkened and the hospital lights began to glow, Kenny stood at his usual spot. He didn't have water bottles today. He'd sold them all early. But he still came. He looked up at the window and shouted, "Hey, I'm Kenny. What's your name?" No response. He laughed anyway. "You don't talk much, huh? That's okay. I talk too much for both of us." He began to tell a story about how he once tried to dance in the middle of traffic and almost got splashed by muddy water. He flung his arms around, exaggerating every move, acting out drivers, honking and shouting. From inside, Richard watched. He felt a smile creeping up again. For a boy who hadn't moved in months, even that tiny curl of his lips felt like flight. He lifted one finger, slowly pressed it against the glass, and drew something new. A small circle, then another, 2 circles. Eyes. Kenny stopped mid-sentence. "Wait, you're drawing?" Richard's finger moved again, sketching a shaky line beneath the 2 circles. Another smiling face. Kenny laughed so loud people turned to stare. "So you can draw, huh? Okay, I'll call you Smiley." He pressed both hands to his chest and grinned upward. "Smiley, you just made my whole day." Inside the room, Richard leaned back, still smiling. The nurse watching from the doorway covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Outside, Kenny picked up a piece of chalk he'd found on the ground and began drawing too. Little stick figures on the hospital wall. 2 boys, one sitting, one standing, both smiling. He pointed at the drawing, then at the window. "That's us," he said proudly. "You and me. Friends, yeah?" Richard didn't reply, but for the first time since his mother died, he didn't feel alone. That night, when Edward came home, he found his son staring at the window again. But this time, the boy's face wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Edward stood by the door, silent. He didn't know that beyond that glass, in the chaos of the streets, a barefoot boy had already done something his wealth never could. Make his son feel alive again. And as the city lights flickered outside, Two boys in two different worlds fell asleep under the same sky, one dreaming of a friend he had finally reached, and the other dreaming of the boy who had finally smiled. The days that followed were the happiest Richard Lawson Jr. had known since the accident. Each afternoon, the sound of laughter drifted faintly through the third-floor window. Not from him, but from below, where Kenny stood, waving and talking like the world's greatest storyteller. He told tales of the city streets, of taxi drivers who argued over 50 naira, of women who fought in the market over pepper, of nights when the rain poured so hard he danced just to stay warm. His words were clumsy, his stories wild, but they were full of life, and somehow that life began to wake Richard up. His eyes no longer looked empty. His hands rested more firmly on the wheelchair arms. When Kenny mimicked drivers honking, Richard's lips twitched. When Kenny pretended to slip on a banana peel, he smiled. And when the boy shouted, "You're my friend now, you know that?" Richard nodded. Every nod, every small smile, every twitch of his hand became a quiet victory. The nurses noticed. The therapist whispered, and Edward Lawson began to hope again. One evening, as Edward walked down the hospital corridor, he overheard two nurses talking in excitement. "It's a miracle," one said. "The boy moved his hands again. On his own." Edward stopped mid-step. "My son." "Yes, sir," the nurse stammered. "It's the most progress he's shown in a year." He hurried toward the room, but when he entered, he found the window half open and a strange sight waiting for him. Outside, a small barefoot boy was standing by the wall, laughing, waving both hands toward his son's window. And inside, his son, his paralyzed son, was waving weakly back. For a moment, Edward simply froze. His heart pounded. The sight of that ragged boy on hospital grounds felt wrong. His first thought wasn't wonder, it was alarm. Who was this child? How had he gotten here? What if he was dangerous? He turned to the nurse sharply. "Who is that boy?" "I don't know, sir," she said. "He comes every day. The patients call him the water boy. He—" But Edward didn't wait to hear more. His face hardened, years of business instinct taking over. "Get security," he ordered. "Now." Outside, Kenny had just finished his latest story, the one about chasing a runaway chicken in the market. He turned around and froze when he saw two uniformed guards walking quickly toward him. "Hey, you there!" one shouted. "Come here!" Kenny panicked. He'd been chased off properties before, markets, malls, even church gates, but never a hospital. He grabbed his crate and tried to run, but the guards caught up quickly. "What are you doing here?" one barked. "Who told you to come to this window?" Kenny stammered. "I wasn't stealing, sir. I was just—" Before he could finish, a tall man in a gray suit appeared. His voice was cold, heavy with authority. "You're the one who's been trespassing on my property." Kenny looked up, confused. "Your property?" "Yes," the man snapped. "I'm Edward Lawson. My son is in that room. You've been disturbing him, haven't you?" Kenny shook his head quickly. "No, sir. I was just talking to him. He looks sad. I wanted to make him smile." "Smile?" Edward's voice hardened. "You sneak around a hospital and think it's a game?" "I swear, sir, I didn't mean any harm," Kenny said, tears starting to fill his eyes. "He waved at me. He drew on the glass. He's my friend." Edward's jaw tightened. He didn't want to believe a word. To him, this boy was a risk, a stranger invading his son's fragile peace. "Take him out," he told the guards, "and don't let him near this hospital again." "Please, sir," Kenny cried, clutching his crate. "Please don't send me away. He laughs now because of me. He wasn't laughing before, right?" Edward hesitated. The words stung, but pride drowned the small voice of doubt inside him. "Enough," he said coldly, turning away. The guards pulled Kenny back roughly. The boy didn't fight. He just kept shouting, "Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I'll come back tomorrow." Inside the room, Richard had seen everything from his window. He slammed his hands weakly against the glass, tears welling up in his eyes, but no one heard. The boy who had brought him light was being dragged away like a criminal. That night, the mansion felt colder than ever. Richard refused to eat. He didn't speak or move. His eyes stared blankly again. This time, not at emptiness, but at the memory of a friend disappearing through a hospital gate. 2 days passed. Kenny didn't return. The window stayed empty. The smile on the glass began to fade under layers of dust. Inside, Richard grew restless. He refused therapy. He barely blinked. His nurses worried he'd slip backward. When Edward came to visit, he found his son's eyes full of tears. "What's wrong, Junior?" he whispered. "Talk to me." But Richard couldn't speak. He simply pointed at the window. Edward followed his gaze, saw the fading smile, and suddenly felt something heavy in his chest. The nurse beside him said softly, "Sir, that boy you sent away, he was the reason your son was improving." Edward frowned. "What do you mean?" "Your son waited for him every day. When he was here, your boy moved. He smiled. That child gave him hope." Edward turned toward the window again, guilt beginning to sting his pride. "Find that boy," he ordered quietly. It took hours, but eventually one of the hospital attendants tracked Kenny down. Under a bridge near the market, sitting alone, hugging his knees, his empty crate beside him. Edward stepped out of his car slowly. Kenny looked up, startled, ready to run. But Edward's voice wasn't cold this time. "Wait, I just want to talk." The man knelt down, something he hadn't done for anyone in years. "You said my son laughed because of you. Tell me, how did you meet him?" Kenny wiped his eyes. "I saw him by the window. He looked lonely. I just wanted to help." Edward studied the boy's face. Thin, tired, honest. "Why?" "Because I know what it feels like," Kenny said softly, "to have no one." Edward swallowed hard. There was something in the boy's voice. Raw, familiar. "Where are your parents?" Kenny hesitated. "My mother died in a car accident. Long time ago." Edward froze. "A car accident?" "Yes, sir. She was crossing the road with me. A black car came fast. They said the driver was rich. He didn't stop." The world seemed to stop spinning. Edward's breath caught in his throat. His mind flashed back to that night. The rain, the shattered windshield, the second car he had hit head-on, the second ambulance he never waited to see. He whispered, voice breaking, "Your mother? She was in that accident?" Kenny looked confused. "Yes, sir. But how did you—" Edward's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was the man driving that car." Silence hung heavy between them. The sound of traffic faded, the world shrinking to just a man crushed by guilt and a boy whose mother he had taken. Kenny's eyes widened. He stepped back slowly, shaking his head. You killed my mother?" Edward's lips trembled. "It was an accident, son, I swear. I tried to save her. I didn't know you survived." Kenny's eyes flooded. "All these years I begged the sky to show me why she died, and now I know." He turned away, voice breaking. "The man whose son I helped took my mother from me." Edward tried to reach for him, but the boy ran, down the road into the night, disappearing among the noise and lights. That night, Edward sat in his car for hours, staring into nothing, the weight of his sin pressing on his soul. At home, Richard waited by the window again, watching the darkness. He didn't know where Kenny was. He didn't know what had happened. He just knew that something in his world had broken again. Edward looked at his reflection in the windshield, a man with everything, yet hollow. And for the first time in years, tears ran freely down his face. He whispered into the silence, "God, how do I make this right?" The night was heavy with rain. Thunder rolled across the sky like grief that refused to sleep, and Edward Lawson sat alone in his car, parked near the bridge where he had last seen Kenny disappear. The wipers swayed back and forth, but they couldn't clear the storm inside him. He had lived through losses before, money, deals, reputation, but nothing felt like this. This was a loss that reached into his soul and refused to let go. He had spent years trying to buy peace, and now he realized peace couldn't be purchased. It had to be earned. The next morning, Edward returned to the hospital. His son sat by the window as usual, eyes fixed on the street below. But there was no sparkle in them anymore. No life, no waiting. "Kenny hasn't come," the nurse said softly. "He hasn't been here since that night." Edward's chest tightened. He walked to his son and knelt beside the wheelchair. "Junior," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Do you miss him?" Richard blinked slowly and nodded. Edward's throat burned. "I do too." For the first time in years, Edward didn't hide his emotions from his son. He took his hand and held it tightly. "You deserve to smile again, son. And that boy, he deserves a chance to live again. I took too much from him already." He stood up, determination in his eyes. "I'm going to find him." It took days. Edward sent people to search the city, from bus parks to under bridges, from street corners to abandoned buildings. Still no sign of Kenny, until one evening, a driver called him. "Sir, I think I've seen the boy, near the old marketplace. He's alone." Edward drove there himself, his heart pounding with guilt and hope. The market was quiet now, the air thick with the smell of dust and rain. Under a half-broken shed sat Kenny, barefoot, arms wrapped around his knees, staring at the ground. Edward stepped out slowly, his expensive shoes sinking into the mud. He approached, his voice gentle but uncertain. "Kenny!" The boy looked up sharply, eyes red from crying. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see you," Edward said softly. "To tell you I'm sorry." Kenny stood, his body tense. "Sorry? You think sorry will bring my mother back?" "No," Edward whispered. "But maybe it can bring you back." The boy turned away, silent. Edward took a breath. "You have every right to hate me. I took something precious from you, and nothing I do will ever fix that. But I swear to you, Kenny, if I could trade places with your mother that night, I would." His voice broke as he fell to his knees in the mud. "Please forgive me. Not for me, for my son. He misses you. You gave him life again, and since you left, he's gone back to the darkness." Kenny's lips trembled. He had never seen a man like Edward, powerful, respected, kneel before anyone. "I didn't know," Edward continued. "I didn't know the boy who saved my son was the son of the woman I killed." Kenny looked at him for a long moment. Then he whispered, "I didn't save him. He saved me too." Tears filled Edward's eyes. "Then let's save each other, Kenny. Please come home." That night, for the first time in weeks, Kenny followed Edward back to the mansion. The guards opened the gate slowly, unsure what to make of the barefoot boy walking beside the billionaire. Inside, the house felt different. Warm lights glowed through the windows and faint music played from the living room, something Edward hadn't allowed in years. When they entered Richard's room, the boy looked up, his eyes wide. For a moment, he didn't move, afraid it was another dream. Then Kenny smiled and whispered, "Hey, Smiley, I told you I'd make you laugh again." Richard's face lit up instantly. His hand trembled as he reached out, pressing it against the wheelchair handle. His lips curved into a small, brave grin. Kenny laughed, wiping his eyes. "That's my guy." Edward stood behind them, watching in awe. Something unexplainable filled the air. Something bigger than medicine, bigger than money. Hope. Days turned into weeks. Kenny stayed in the mansion, at first as a guest, then as family. He ate at the same table, slept in a real bed, and attended physical therapy sessions with Richard every morning. He cheered every small movement, every wobble, every partial step. When Richard managed to lift himself an inch from the wheelchair, Kenny clapped like the world had won gold. "See," he said, laughing, "you're stronger than you think." And Richard, though still silent, began to believe him. Edward watched quietly from the corner, humbled. The mansion that once echoed with silence now rang with laughter again. The laughter of two boys who had both lost too much, yet found each other. One afternoon during therapy, something miraculous happened. Richard pushed himself upright, gripping the parallel bars with trembling hands. Kenny stood beside him, holding his breath. "Come on," Kenny whispered. "You got this." Richard's face tightened in concentration. His legs shook, his arms strained. And then slowly, his feet pressed down on the floor. He was standing. Not tall, not steady, but standing. Kenny gasped. "You did it, Smiley. You're standing." Edward rushed forward, his hands over his mouth, tears blurring his vision. His son, the boy who hadn't walked in a year, was standing beside the boy whose mother he had taken. It was as if heaven itself had written forgiveness into their story. Richard fell back into the chair, laughing and crying at once. Kenny knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders. "You did it, man," he said, voice shaking. "You actually did it." Edward joined them, falling to his knees. He placed one hand on each of their shoulders. "Both of you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You both healed me more than you'll ever know." In the weeks that followed, the Lawson mansion was no longer a house of silence. It was a home again. Richard continued to improve. With each day, his steps grew steadier, his smile wider. Kenny started school, something he never thought possible, and Edward made sure he never went hungry or cold again. But more than comfort, Edward gave Kenny something greater: belonging. People in the city soon heard about it. The story spread like fire. A billionaire adopts a homeless boy who saved his paralyzed son. Some called it reckless. Others called it divine. When reporters asked Edward why he did it, he smiled and said, "Because that boy gave me something no amount of money ever could: forgiveness." Months later, under the same hospital window where they first met, the two boys stood side by side. Kenny held a paintbrush, and Richard guided his hand. Together they painted a mural, two smiling faces under a bright blue sky. Below it, they wrote four simple words: "Love heals the broken." Edward watched them from a distance, his heart full. He whispered, almost to himself, "I thought I was the one saving them, but the truth is, they saved me." That night, as the city lights glittered and the mansion lights dimmed, the sound of laughter echoed softly through the halls. The laughter of two boys who had once been strangers, now brothers, bound not by blood, but by grace. And for the first time in years, Edward Lawson fell asleep smiling. Because at last he understood the greatest truth of all: money can build towers, but only love can build hearts.